stylus moves slowly across the wet clay. Outside, the sun has not yet cleared the eastern wall of the temple precinct, and the air in the scribal chamber is cool enough that the tablet stays workable longer than it will by midday. He is 26 years old, a junior scribe in the House of Tablets at Nippur, and this morning he has been assigned a text that makes his hand hesitate every few lines. Not because the cuneiform is difficult. He has been reading and writing since he was 7, but because the numbers he's copying are unlike any he has encountered in the grain accounts, the field surveys, the royal decrees. The text before him, worn and recopied many times before it reached his hands, begins with the phrase that every scribe in Sumer knows by heart. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship was in Eridu. But what follows is not the familiar litany of historical kings. The reigns are measured in sars. A sar is 3,600 years. The first king, Alulim, ruled for 8 sars, 28,800 years. He pauses, checks the reference tablet to his left, confirms the number, and presses the wedge into the clay. The second king, Alalanga, ruled for 10 sars, 36,000 years. The third king, Enmenluana, ruled for 12 sars, 43,200 years. He works carefully, not allowing himself to think yet about what these numbers mean, or whether they mean anything at all. 5 cities, 8 kings, 241,200 years. Then, in a single line of compressed script, the text says, "The flood swept over." After that, the numbers drop. The kings who come after the flood rule for hundreds of years, then dozens, then lengths of time that fall within the boundaries of a human life. He finishes the antediluvian section just as the light reaches the window. He sets the tablet aside to dry and pulls a fresh one from the stack. Tonight, after the evening meal, he will ask his senior if anyone knows where these numbers come from. That scene took place in the city of Nippur, in what is now southern Iraq, sometime during the Earth-3 period, roughly 2100 years before the Common Era. The tablet the scribe was copying no longer exists, but more than a dozen later versions of the same text have survived, scattered across museums in Oxford, Berkeley, Philadelphia, and Istanbul. Modern scholars call it the Sumerian King List. It is one of the oldest coherent historical documents in the world, and it contains a claim so stark that most histories of Mesopotamia mention it briefly and then move on. Before the great flood that reset the world, kingship existed on Earth for 241,200 years, and the beings who ruled during that time were not entirely human. You are listening to a documentary for sleep. The runtime is approximately 2 hours. The script you are hearing is built to be absorbed slowly at rest with no need to keep alert. If you drift in and out, you will not lose the thread. If you stay to the end, you will hear the whole account, built not from modern speculation, but from the texts themselves, copied in sequence, stored in temple libraries, recopied across centuries, translated into Akkadian, referenced by Berossus the Babylonian priest when he wrote his history for the Greeks in the 3rd century before the Common Era, and recovered piece by piece from the ruins of ancient cities over the past 150 years. The topic tonight is the Sumerian King List, what it says about the time before the flood, and who or what the Anunnaki were according to the people who wrote their names into clay. The Sumerian King List exists in more than 15 fragmentary or complete copies, composed over a span of roughly 1,000 years. The earliest confirmed version was written during the dynasty of Akkad, around 2,300 years before the Common Era. The most complete single copy is a small clay prism held in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford. Catalogued as Object WB 1923 4, inscribed during the reign of a king of the Isin dynasty in the early 2nd millennium. The text follows a fixed structure. It begins with a formulaic line. After kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. Then it lists the kings who ruled in 5 cities before the flood: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. After a summary line stating that the flood swept over, it resumes with the dynasty of Kish, the first city to receive kingship after the waters receded. From that point onward, the reigns become shorter, and the names of the kings begin to match other known records. Archaeological evidence confirms many of the post-flood dynasties: Kish, Uruk, Ur, Lagash. Objects bearing royal names appear in datable strata. Cylinder seals name the same kings the king list names. Treaty texts and year names cross-reference. The post-flood section, though not free of exaggeration, sits inside the realm of history as conventionally understood. The antediluvian section does not. Here is the full antediluvian sequence as it appears in the most complete versions of the text. In Eridu, Alulim ruled for 28,800 years. Alaunga ruled for 36,000 years. In Bad Tibira, Enmen-Luana ruled for 43,200 years. Enmen-Gal-Ana ruled for 28,800 years. Dumuzid the shepherd ruled for 36,000 years. In Lairak, Ensipadzid-Ana ruled for 28,800 years. In Sipa, Enmendur-Ana ruled for 21,000 years. In Shurupak-Ubatutu ruled for 18,600 years. 8 kings, 5 cities, total duration 241,200 years. Then the flood. Then kingship begins again in Kish, and the reigns of the kings are counted in years that fit within the span of several human lifetimes. The Sumerian word used in the antediluvian section to denote the status of these rulers is Lugal, which means king. But the king list does not stand alone. Other Sumerian texts from the 3rd and early 2nd millennium elaborate on the period before the flood and name the beings who held authority during that time. In the myths, in the temple hymns, in the incantation series, and in the ritual instructions copied in the scribal schools of Nippur, Uruk, and Ur, these beings are called the Anunnaki. The word appears more than 100 times across the corpus of Sumerian religious literature. It is a collective term, often paired with the Igigi, another class of divine beings. The Anunnaki are usually described as the great gods, the judges of the underworld, or the deities who decreed fates. In the myth known as the Descent of Inanna, the Anunnaki sit in the underworld as a council of 7 judges. In the creation account preserved in fragmentary form in the myth called the Song of the Hoe, the Anunnaki are present when humankind is separated from the gods and assigned the task of agricultural labour. In the Sumerian flood story, preserved on a tablet from Nippur and dated to the 17th century before the Common Era, the decision to send the flood is made by the high gods, and the Anunnaki are named among those who execute the decree. The Anunnaki are not described in Sumerian literature as a separate biological species. They are gods, but gods who lived on Earth, who ruled cities, who established kingship, and who, according to the internal chronology of the king list, did so for nearly 250,000 years before the flood reset the count. The standard historical interpretation of the Sumerian king list treats the antediluvian section as a theological preamble, a narrative device to anchor earthly kingship in divine precedent. According to this view, the enormous reign lengths are symbolic, not literal. They serve to distinguish the mythical past from the historical present, to mark the flood as a boundary between the age of the gods and the age of men. This interpretation is not arbitrary. It rests on the observable fact that no human being lives 28,000 years, and on the methodological principle that texts combining myth and history should be read with attention to genre. The post-flood section of the king list can be checked against external evidence. The antediluvian section cannot, because no contemporary artifacts, no inscriptions, no stratified architecture has been found that dates to the time frame the numbers describe. The cities named in the antediluvian section, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak Sipa, Shurupak, are real. Eridu has been excavated. The lowest levels of occupation at the site date to the late 6th millennium before the Common Era, roughly 5,800 years ago. Shurupak, modern Tel Farah, has been excavated. Tablets inscribed with economic texts and literary works have been found there, dating to the mid-3rd millennium. Bad Tibira, Larak, and Sipa are mentioned in other texts and have been tentatively identified with archaeological sites, though none has been excavated to bedrock. But nowhere at any of these sites has any object been found that could plausibly be dated to 240,000 years ago. The oldest known cities in Mesopotamia, based on radiocarbon dating and stratigraphy, are between 6,000 and 7,000 years old. The oldest writing is 5,300 years old. Homo sapiens as a species is roughly 300,000 years old. Behaviourally modern humans, characterised by symbolic thought, complex tools and artistic production, appear in the archaeological record between 70,000 and 100,000 years ago. There is no category of evidence within the framework of conventional archaeology or paleoanthropology that allows for cities ruled by named kings 241,000 years before a flood that itself cannot be dated. That is the glitch. The antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list does not align with any material evidence, nor with the timeline of human development reconstructed from fossils, tools, and genes. And yet the scribes who copied it did not mark it as myth. They did not separate it from the historical section with a change in genre or a narrative frame. The text moves seamlessly from Ubar-Tutu of Shurupak, who ruled for 18,600 years, to the flood, to the first king of Kish, whose reign is listed as 1,200 years, to the second king of Kish, whose reign is 960 years, and onward in a continuous descending curve until the reigns stabilise in the range of decades, at which point the names begin to coincide with known historical figures from the mid-3rd millennium. There is no textual marker that says, "Now we leave the age of metaphor and enter the age of Jilu." The king list presents itself as a unified chronology. Kingship was lowered from heaven. It began in Eridu. 8 kings ruled 5 cities for 241,000 years. The flood came. Kingship was lowered again to Kish. The list continues. What follows in this script is not an argument that the numbers should be read as literal chronological fact. It is an examination of what the Sumerian texts actually say about the antediluvian period, who the Anunnaki were according to those texts, how the king list was compiled and transmitted, what the reigns of the 8 kings were believed to represent, and what intellectual and theological framework allowed the scribes of Sumer and Akkad to place these numbers at the beginning of their history without apparent discomfort. The method will be to take the texts in their own words, in the order they were written, and to hear what the ancients said before deciding what they meant. The city of Eridu sits at the edge of the marshes. It is not yet dawn. A thin mist rises from the canals that thread between the reed beds, and the air smells of wet earth and old smoke. The temple platform rises in the centre of the settlement, a stepped mound of mud brick faced with white gypsum that catches the first light while the houses below remain in shadow. On the upper terrace, in a room whose walls are lined with benches of packed clay, an old man sits with his back to the eastern window. He is perhaps 60, which in this time and place makes him ancient. His name is not recorded, but his function is. He is the Abzu priest, the keeper of the Temple of Enki, the lord of the sweet waters beneath the earth. In front of him, on a low table, lies a tablet older than anything else in the temple archive. It is thick, heavy, the clay baked hard by time and heat, the script archaic, the signs cut deep. He cannot read all of it. Some of the signs are formed in a manner no longer used, but he knows what it says because he was told what it says by the priest, who held this position before him, who was told by the priest before him, and so on back through a chain of transmission that he believes extends to the time when the words were first written. The tablet is a king list. It begins with Eridu, it begins with Alulim. Eridu is the oldest cult site in southern Mesopotamia, whose location is certain. The modern name of the site is Tel Abu Sharain, in the Dekar Governorate of Iraq, roughly 12 miles southwest of the ruins of Ur. Excavations conducted in the late 1940s and early 1950s by the Iraq Directorate General of Antiquities, under the direction of Fuad Safar and Seton Lloyd, revealed a sequence of temple buildings stretching back to the Ubaid period, the earliest phase of settled agricultural life in southern Mesopotamia. The lowest level of the temple sequence, designated Temple Level Liuxantine, was a small rectangular building with an offering table and a niche for a cult statue, built directly on clean sand at a depth of roughly 5 meters below the later temple platforms. Radiocarbon dates and pottery typology place this structure in the late 6th millennium before the Common Era, sometime between 5,800 and 5,400 years ago. Above it, in unbroken succession, 16 more temples were built on the same spot, each aligned on the same axis, each slightly larger than the last, each built over the ruins of the one before. By the time the sequence reaches Temple Level 1, the structure is a massive ziggurat complex covering several hectares, built during the 3rd dynasty of Ur in the 21st century before the Common Era. The continuity of cult practice at Eridu across more than 3,000 years is unique in Mesopotamian archaeology. No other site shows such unbroken religious continuity over such a span. The later Sumerian and Babylonian tradition remembered Eridu as the first city, the city of the god Enki, the place where order was first established on earth. Alulim is the first name on the Sumerian king list. In the Oxford Prism, and in the other complete versions, his name is written with 3 cuneiform signs, Alulim. The name does not have a clear etymology in Sumerian, and some scholars have suggested it may be a loan from an earlier non-Sumerian language. He is called the King of Eridu, and his reign is given as 8 Sars, which equals 28,800 years. No other text from the Sumerian corpus mentions Alulim by name, except the king list and its derivatives. There is no hymn to Alulim, no myth in which he appears as a character, no temple inscription claiming his patronage. In the vast archive of Sumerian literature spanning more than 4,000 cuneiform tablets, Alulim is a single entry in a single genre of text, the king list. He is a name and a number, but the text does not treat him as a fictional invention. It places him in a real city, at the beginning of a sequence that continues without interruption into the historical period, and it assigns him a reign length measured in the same unit, the Sar, that is used in astronomical and mathematical texts to count very long intervals of time. The Sar is a numerical unit that appears throughout Mesopotamian mathematics and metrology. It is the square of 60, the base of the sexagesimal counting system used by the Sumerians and inherited by every subsequent Mesopotamian culture. 1 Sar equals 3,600. In land measurement, a Sar is the area of a square with sides of 60 cubits. In time measurement, a Sar is 3,600 years. The use of the Sar in the antediluvian section of the king list is deliberate and consistent. Alulim, 8 Sars. Alalangar, 10 Sars. Enmenluana, 12 Sars. Enmengarlana, 8 Sars. Dumuzid, 10 Sars. Ensipadzid Ana, 8 Sars. Enmendur Ana, 5 Sars plus 3 Nairs. Ubatutu, 5 Sars plus 1 Nair. A Nair is 600. The total, calculated by the scribes themselves and stated explicitly in some versions of the text, is 241,200 years, or 67 Sars. The precision of the arithmetic is notable. The numbers are not round. They are not vague. They are calculated, summed and transmitted across multiple manuscript traditions with minimal variation. The second king is Alalangar, also called King of Eridu, also otherwise unattested in Sumerian literature outside the king list. His reign, 10 Sars, 36,000 years. Then kingship, according to the text, moved to Bad Tibira. The Sumerian phrase is Bad Tibira became the seat of kingship. Bad Tibira is identified with the archaeological site of Tel el-Madain, roughly 60 miles northwest of Eridu, though the identification is tentative and the site has not been systematically excavated. In later Babylonian tradition, Bad Tibira is associated with metalworking, and the name has been interpreted as Fortress of the Coppersmiths or Wall of the Metalworkers. 3 kings ruled there before the flood: Enmenlu-Ana, Enmengal-Ana, and Dumuzid. Enmenlu-Ana is the 3rd king, 12 Sars, 43,200 years. His name can be translated as Lord of the Good Me of Heaven. The word me is one of the most important and least translatable terms in Sumerian theology. It refers to the divine powers, laws, or decrees that govern the cosmos. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, the me are physical objects that Inanna steals from Enki while he is drunk, taking them from Eridu to Uruk. In the Sumerian hymn to the Akur, the me are described as the foundation of heaven and earth. In lexical lists, more than 100 individual me are named, including kingship, priesthood, victory, music, sexual intercourse, and the destruction of cities. Enmenlu-Ana, the lord of the good me of heaven, ruled for 43,200 years in Bad Tibira. No other text mentions him. Enmengal-Ana is the 4th king, 8 Sars, 28,800 years. His name means Lord of the Great Me of Heaven. He ruled in Bad Tibira. He is not mentioned elsewhere in the Sumerian textual corpus, except in one fragmentary Akkadian omen text that may refer to him under a variant name. Then comes Dumuzid, the shepherd, 10 Sars, 36,000 years. This is the only antediluvian king whose name appears frequently in other Sumerian texts. Dumuzid, also known as Tammuz in later Akkadian tradition, is a central figure in Sumerian mythology. He is the husband of the goddess Inanna, and his death and seasonal return from the underworld form the subject of several major Sumerian myths and liturgical laments. But the Dumuzid of the myths is usually described as a mortal king of Uruk, not an antediluvian king of Bad Tibira. Some versions of the king list distinguish between Dumuzid the shepherd, who ruled before the flood, and a later Dumuzid who ruled in Uruk after the flood. Other versions conflate them. The presence of Dumuzid in the antediluvian section creates a textual problem that ancient and modern commentators have handled in different ways, but the fact remains. The king list places a king named Dumuzid in Bad Tibira, before the flood, with a reign of 36,000 years. Kingship then moved to Larak. The site of Larak has not been definitively identified. Some scholars have proposed Tel El Wilaya, others have suggested it may be a name for a district of another city, rather than an independent settlement. One king is listed, Ensipat Zidana, 8 Sars, 28,800 years. The name means Lord of the True Shepherd, Staff of Heaven. Like the others, he's not mentioned in any other surviving text. Kingship moved to Sippar. Sippar is well attested in later periods. It was an important cult centre of the sun god Shamash, located north of Babylon, and the site has been excavated. The antediluvian strata, if they exist, have not been reached. One king is listed for Sippar in the antediluvian period, En-men-Durana. His reign is given as 5 Sars and 3 Nirs, which equals 21,000 years. The name means Lord whose me connect heaven and earth. En-men-Durana is unique among the antediluvian kings in that he does appear, under a slightly different form of the name, in one other early text. A late Babylonian commentary on omens, part of the series known as the Counsels of a Pessimist, mentions a figure called Enmeduranki, described as a king of Sippar who was beloved of the gods Anu, Enlil, and Ea, and who was taken up to heaven and taught the secrets of divination by the sun god Shamash and the storm god Adad. The text says that Enmeduranki was shown the tablet of the gods, taught the secrets of oil, cedar and cypress divination, and given the tablet and stylus, and that he then transmitted this knowledge to the people of Sippar. This is the only antediluvian king for whom we have a narrative tradition separate from the bare entry in the king list. Enmeduranki, or En-men-Durana, is remembered as the first diviner, the intermediary between gods and men, the one who brought sacred knowledge from heaven to earth. Kingship moved to Shuruppak. The site of Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, is approximately 35 miles northwest of Eridu. It was excavated by German and American teams in the early 20th century and again in the 1970s. Thousands of tablets were recovered, dating primarily to the early dynastic Thi period, around 2600 years before the Common Era. Among them are administrative documents, literary texts, and the earliest known copies of some Sumerian proverbs. A stratum of water-laid silt was found at the site, interpreted by some excavators as evidence of a local flood, though the date and extent of that flooding are debated. One king is listed for antediluvian Shuruppak, Ubar-Tutu, 5 Sars and 1 Ner, 18,600 years. Ubar-Tutu is the father of Ziusudra, the Sumerian Noah, the man who built the ark and survived the flood. The Sumerian flood story, preserved on a single damaged tablet from Nippur, names Ziusudra as the son of Ubar-Tutu and describes him as a pious king of Shuruppak who receives a warning from the god Enki that the great gods have decided to send a flood to destroy humanity. Enki instructs Ziusudra to build a boat, to seal it with bitumen, and to bring aboard the seed of all living things. Ziusudra does so. The flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights. When the waters recede, Ziusudra offers sacrifice, and the gods grant him eternal life and settle him in Dilmun, the land of the living. The text breaks off shortly after. The same story, with variations, appears in Akkadian as the Atrahasis epic, and as the 11th tablet of the Gilgamesh epic. The Akkadian hero is called Atrahasis, or Utnapishtim. The Greek version recorded by Berossus calls him Xisuthros. All derive from the Sumerian Ziusudra, whose father Ubar-Tutu is the 8th and final king of the antediluvian period. Then comes the line, the flood swept over. In Sumerian, Amaruba, literally, the flood, it swept. Some versions add, after the flood had swept over and kingship had descended from heaven a second time, kingship was in Kish. The narrative continuity is seamless. The flood is treated as a historical event, a catastrophic boundary that ends one phase of kingship and begins another. The cities that held kingship before the flood are not said to have been destroyed. The text does not say the world was uninhabited after the flood. It says kingship was lowered again to a new city, Kish, and the list resumes. The first king of Kish is Gawur, whose reign is listed as 1200 years. The second is Gula Nideba Anapad, 960 years. The third is Palakinatim, 900 years. The reigns are still far longer than a human lifespan, but they have dropped by an order of magnitude. No more Sars. The descent continues through the dynasties of Kish, Uruk, Awan and Hamazi, until by the time the list reaches the historical dynasties of Lagash and Akkad in the mid-3rd millennium, the reign lengths have stabilized in the range of decades. The transition from the antediluvian to the post-diluvian is numerically smooth, a logarithmic decay curve, not a sharp break. This is what the Sumerian king list says. 8 kings ruled 5 cities for 241,200 years. Those kings had names. Those cities were real places, remembered and inhabited in later periods. The unit of time used to measure their reigns was the same unit used in mathematics, astronomy, and metrology throughout Mesopotamian history. The flood came. Kingship resumed. The reigns shortened progressively until they reached human scale, at which point the kings named in the list begin to appear in external sources, seal impressions, building inscriptions, year names, synchronisms with Egypt and Elam. The antediluvian section is not set off as myth. It is the first chapter of a continuous historical record. The House of Tablets at Nippur occupies the northeastern quarter of the temple precinct, a compound of narrow rooms built around a central courtyard where the apprentice scribes sit in rows practicing their signs on practice tablets that will be smoothed and reused tomorrow. It is late afternoon, the light slanting in low through the doorway, and the senior instructor is dictating from memory. The subject today is the Anunnaki. The students, boys between the ages of 10 and 16, write as he speaks, their styli moving in unison across the soft clay. The Anunnaki are the great gods, the instructor says. They are 50 in number. They are the children of An. 7 of them decree fate. They sit in the underworld. They judge the dead. One of the older boys raises his hand and asks, "Master, where do the Anunnaki live?" The instructor pauses, considering the question. "They live in the Ekur," he says. "They live in the Abzu. They live in the underworld. They live where the gods live." The boy frowns, unsatisfied, but does not press further. The instructor continues. "Before the flood, the Anunnaki ruled the earth. After the flood, they gave kingship to men." He does not explain how long before the flood, or in what manner the Anunnaki ruled, because the text he is dictating from does not explain it either. It is simply stated as a fact. The word Anunnaki appears in Sumerian cuneiform as Anunnaki or Anunna, and in Akkadian as Anunnaku or Anunnaki. The etymology is disputed, but the most widely accepted analysis passes it as offspring of An, or those of princely seed, with An being the sky god, the head of the Sumerian pantheon. In the earliest Sumerian god lists dating to the early dynastic period around 2600 years before the Common Era, the Anunnaki are classified as a collective group of deities, distinct from but related to another group called the Igigi. The precise distinction between Anunnaki and Igigi shifts across different periods and text traditions. In some contexts, the Igigi are described as the younger gods who perform labour for the Anunnaki. In others, the terms seem to be used interchangeably. By the Old Babylonian period, around 2000 years before the Common Era, the standard formulation places the Anunnaki in the underworld or on earth and the Igigi in heaven. The earliest mythological text that describes the Anunnaki in detail is the Sumerian creation account embedded in the preamble to the poem Gilgamesh, Enkidu, and the Netherworld, dated to the III or early Old Babylonian period. In that text, after heaven and earth have been separated and before humankind has been created, the Anunnaki are described as living on earth, performing agricultural labour, digging canals and dredging rivers. The text does not give a time frame, but the setting is explicitly pre-human. The Anunnaki are gods, but they are also workers. The poem does not resolve the apparent contradiction. The longest and most detailed account of the Anunnaki's role in the creation of humanity is the Akkadian myth known as the Atrahasis epic, preserved in multiple copies from the Old Babylonian period and later. The poem opens with a description of the division of the cosmos. The god Anu takes the heavens, the god Enlil takes the earth, the god Enki takes the Abzu, the freshwater ocean beneath the earth. The Anunnaki are assigned to earth under Enlil's authority, and the Igigi are assigned to hard labour, digging the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, clearing irrigation canals, carrying earth in baskets. The work is brutal and unending. The Igigi labour for 40 years, the text says, 40 years they bore the toil until they rebel. They burn their tools and march on Enlil's temple at night, surrounding it and demanding relief. Enlil is terrified and calls an assembly of the great gods. Anu and Enki arrive, and the council convenes. The Igigi present their case. The labour is too hard, the work is killing them, they cannot continue. Enki proposes a solution. He suggests creating a new class of being to take over the labour. He calls this being Lulu, which means primitive worker, or man. The goddess Nintu, also called Mami or Belet Ili, is summoned. She is the birth goddess, the one who shapes living things. Enki instructs her to mix clay from the Abzu with the blood of a slain god. The text names the slain god as Wheela, one of the Igigi rebels, who was killed specifically for this purpose. His blood is mixed with the clay, and from this mixture Nintu fashions the first humans. 7 males and 7 females are created. They are given the task that the Igigi refused, to dig canals, to plough fields, to serve the gods. The Igigi are freed from labour. The Anunnaki remain on Earth as overseers. Humanity multiplies and spreads across the land. The Atrahasis epic continues. 1200 years pass. Humanity has become too numerous and too noisy. Enlil, who governs the Earth, cannot sleep because of the clamour. He decides to reduce the human population by sending plagues, droughts, and famines. Each time, Enki intervenes and teaches the humans how to survive. Finally, Enlil loses patience and decrees that a flood will be sent to destroy humanity entirely. The gods swear an oath not to warn the humans. Enki, bound by the oath, cannot speak directly to any human, so he speaks to the wall of a reed hut where a man named Atrahasis is sleeping. Atrahasis hears the warning. Enki instructs him through this wall to build a boat, to seal it with bitumen, to bring aboard his family and representatives of all living things. Atrahasis obeys. The flood comes. The storm god Adad roars in the clouds. The Anunnaki, the text says, are terrified. They retreat to the highest heaven and cower like dogs. The goddess Nintu weeps and laments that she agreed to the creation of humanity, only to see them destroyed. The flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights. When it ends, Atrahasis opens a window and offers sacrifice. The gods, who have had no offerings during the flood and are starving, smell the roast meat and gather around the offering like flies. Enlil arrives and is furious that a human has survived. Enki defends his action. A compromise is reached. Humanity will be allowed to continue, but measures will be put in place to control population. Some women will be barren, some children will die young, and there will be priestesses forbidden to bear children. The poem ends with this new order established. The Anunnaki remain on Earth, but their direct rule has ended. Kingship is given to human intermediaries. This is the framework within which the Sumerian king list situates the antediluvian period. The Anunnaki ruled before the flood. The 8 kings named in the king list are either Anunnaki themselves or human kings ruling under Anunnaki authority. The text does not specify which, and the ancient commentators themselves seem to have been uncertain. Berossus, the Babylonian priest who wrote a history of Babylonia in Greek around 280 years before the Common Era, describes the antediluvian kings as a mixture of gods and divinely appointed humans. His account, preserved only in quotations by later Greek and Christian authors, gives 10 antediluvian kings rather than 8, and their combined reign is listed as 432,000 years rather than 241,000. The numbers differ, but the structure is identical. Immensely long reigns, a catastrophic flood, a reduction in lifespan, and the continuation of kingship in a new form. In the temple archive at Uruk, sometime in the late 4th millennium before the Common Era, a scribe is compiling a list. Not a king list, those will come later, but a god list, an enumeration of the deities worshipped in the cities of Sumer. The list is organised hierarchically. At the top is An, the sky. Below him are Enlil, the air, and Enki, the water. Below them are the Anunnaki, listed not by individual names but as a class. The number given is 50. 50 Anunnaki, children of An, governors of Earth. The same number appears in later god lists, in temple hymns, in incantation series. 50 is a conventional number in Sumerian literature, often used to denote completeness or a full assembly, but it is used consistently when referring to the Anunnaki. In the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, set in the paradise land of Dilmun, the Anunnaki are described as decreeing fates. In the Descent of Inanna, 7 Anunnaki sit as judges in the underworld. In the lament for the destruction of Ur, the Anunnaki are named as those who stood by and allowed the city to be destroyed, who did not intervene when Enlil commanded the Elamites and the Gutians to sack the city in the 21st century before the Common Era. There is no single Sumerian text that provides a complete narrative of what the Anunnaki did during the 241,000 years before the flood. The information is scattered across dozens of texts, myths, hymns, laments, incantations, lexical lists, and commentaries. Synthesizing them yields a composite picture, not a coherent story. The Anunnaki are gods. They are the children of An. They're associated with the earth and the underworld. They are judges. They're overseers of human labour. They decreed the fates of cities and kings. Before the flood, they ruled directly. After the flood, they ruled through human intermediaries. They are described in the texts as having bodies, as eating and drinking, as residing in temples, as travelling between heaven and earth. In the poem known as the Marriage of Martu, the Anunnaki are described as feasting. In the Sumerian flood story, the god Enki is described as providing beer and food to the Anunnaki. In the Descent of Inanna, the Anunnaki of the underworld are said to fasten the eye of death on Inanna when she appears before them. The question of whether the Sumerians understood the Anunnaki as literal flesh and blood beings, or as symbolic forces represented anthropomorphically, is a question that cannot be answered definitively from the texts, because the texts do not pose the question in those terms. The Sumerians did not write theology in the form of systematic treatises. They wrote myths, which are narratives. They wrote hymns, which are praises. They wrote incantations, which are performative utterances meant to compel action. In all these genres, the Anunnaki are agents. They act, they speak, they decide, they descend, they ascend, they eat. They are pleased or angry. The grammar of the text treats them as subjects with volition, not as abstract principles. Whether that grammatical treatment corresponds to the metaphysical beliefs of the people who wrote and recited the text is a separate question, and one on which the texts themselves are silent. What is certain is that the scribes who compiled the Sumerian king list believed that kingship had a history that extended far beyond the lifespans recorded in their administrative archives, and that the earliest phase of that history was qualitatively different from the later phases. The antediluvian kings did not build the kinds of monuments that the later kings built. There are no victory stelae of Alulim. There are no cylinder seals of Enmenluana. There are no foundation deposits naming Ubatutu. The memory of the antediluvian period was preserved in texts, not in objects. The texts were copied and recopied, transmitted through the scribal schools, embedded in the curriculum and referenced in commentaries and omen collections. The antediluvian section of the king list was never removed, never marked as doubtful, never relegated to a separate genre. It was the beginning of history. The scribal school at Ur is smaller than the one at Nippur, but its library is older. Some of the tablets stored in the vaulted archive room beneath the Temple of Nana date back to the early dynastic period, more than 400 years before the present dynasty. A young scribe, recently graduated from apprentice status, has been given the task of cataloguing the oldest tablets, cleaning them, checking them for damage, and making fresh copies of any that are deteriorating. One of the tablets he pulls from the shelf is a fragment. Broken on all sides, the script faint. He brings it into the daylight and angles it so the shadows fill the wedges. The text is a hymn, or part of one. It mentions Eridu. It mentions the Abzu, and it contains a phrase he has seen before in the king list but nowhere else. When kingship was lowered from heaven, he sets the fragment aside and pulls another. This one is more complete. It is a temple hymn, one of a series attributed to the priestess Enheduanna, daughter of Sargon of Akkad, who lived 200 years ago and is remembered as the first author in history whose name is known. The hymn is addressed to the temple of Enki at Eridu. It describes the temple as the place where the Mi were first established, where the plans of heaven and earth were laid out, where the foundations of kingship were set before kingship was given to human hands. The scribe copies the hymn onto a fresh tablet, signs his name at the end, and files both the original and the copy in the catalogue. Later, when he is older and has read more deeply, he will come to understand that this hymn is part of a larger theological claim, that Eridu is not just the first city to receive kingship, but the first city to exist, the prototype of all cities, the place where the boundary between divine and human was first established, and then, at some point in the distant past, crossed. The theology of Eridu is central to understanding how the Sumerian scribes conceived of the antediluvian period. Eridu was the cult centre of the god Enki, also called Ea in Akkadian. Enki is the god of fresh water, of the Abzu. the subterranean ocean from which all springs and rivers are believed to flow. He is also the god of wisdom, craftsmanship, magic, and incantations. In the Sumerian mythological hierarchy, Enki is one of the three great gods who divide the cosmos after the separation of heaven and earth, and takes heaven. Enlil takes the surface of the earth and the air, Enki takes the Abzu and, by extension, the foundational order that supports the visible world. Enki is consistently portrayed in the myths as the friend of humanity. It is Enki who warns Zusudra of the flood. It is Enki who creates humans to relieve the gods of labour. It is Enki who teaches humans the arts of civilization, irrigation, agriculture, writing, divination, music, and law. The temple hymns describe Enki as the one who fixes destinies, who establishes the me, and who gives kingship to the land. In the myth called Enki and the World Order, preserved in a late Old Babylonian version, Enki is described travelling across the known world city by city and region by region, assigning each its function and decreeing its fate. He begins in Sumer, where he establishes the Tigris and Euphrates, fills them with fish, appoints a god to oversee the marshes, a god to oversee the sea, and a god to oversee the rain. He blesses the fields of Sumer with abundance. Then he travels to Meluha, the Indus Valley, and decrees that its people shall bring precious woods and stones. He travels to Dilmun, the island in the Persian Gulf, and decrees that it shall be a place of trade and purity. He travels to Elam, to Mahashi, to the land of the Amorites, assigning each their role in the cosmic order. The poem is structured as a catalogue of the world as the Sumerians knew it, and at the centre of the catalogue is the assertion that the order of the world is not natural or inevitable but decreed, established by divine action at a specific moment in the past. The text does not give a date for this establishment, but other texts place it before the flood, in the time when the Anunnaki governed directly. A related concept appears in the prologue to the Laws of Ur-Nammu, the earliest known law code, promulgated by the founder of the Third Dynasty of Ur around 2100 years before the Common Era. The prologue states that after An and Enlil had given kingship of Ur to the god Nana, and after Nana had chosen Ur-Nammu as his earthly representative, Ur-Nammu established justice in the land, according to the righteous laws of the god Utu, the sun god and god of justice. The text then says, "In those days, in those distant days, in those nights, in those far-off nights, in those years, in those distant years, after the assembly of the gods had established the me, after the Anunnaki had decreed the fates." The sentence trails into a damaged section of the tablet, but the structure is clear. The law code is presented as a restoration of an order established by the Anunnaki in the time before measurable history. The same temporal formula, in those days, in those far-off days, appears in the prologues to several Sumerian myths and in the introductory lines of temple hymns. It is a narrative marker that signals a shift into mythological time, a time qualitatively different from the present. But it is not treated as separate from historical time. It is treated as the beginning of historical time, the phase that precedes and establishes the conditions for the dynastic period. The king list does not use the formula "in those days" because the king list does not distinguish between mythological and historical time. It presents a single continuous chronology, and the antediluvian section is simply the first chapter. In the city of Babylon, in the reign of Hammurabi, around 1700 years before the Common Era, the scribes of the Temple of Marduk are composing a new version of the creation myth. The older Sumerian myths placed Enlil at the head of the pantheon. The Babylonian version will place Marduk there, reflecting the political rise of Babylon as the dominant power in Mesopotamia. But the structure of the cosmos and the role of the Anunnaki will remain largely unchanged. The text that results is known as the Enuma Elish, when on high, named for its first two words. It is the most complete cosmogonic myth to survive from ancient Mesopotamia, preserved on 7 tablets and recopied over more than 1,000 years. The poem begins with a time when nothing existed except Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water. From their mingling, the first gods are born. These primordial gods are noisy and chaotic, and Apsu decides to destroy them. Ea, the Babylonian name for Enki, learns of the plan, casts a spell on Apsu, and kills him. Tiamat, enraged, raises an army of monsters to avenge Apsu. The gods are terrified. None of them can face Tiamat until Marduk, the the young god of Babylon agrees to fight her on the condition that if he wins, he will be made king of the gods. The gods agree. Marduk defeats Tiamat, splits her body in half, and uses the halves to create the sky and the earth. He then organizes the cosmos, assigns the stars and planets their courses, sets the calendar, establishes the seasons, and creates humanity. The purpose of humanity in the Enuma Elish is the same as in the Atrahasis epic: to serve the gods, to perform the labour that the gods no longer wish to perform themselves. Marduk addresses the assembly of the gods and says, "I shall compact blood, I shall cause bones to be, I shall make stand a human being, let man be its name. I shall create humankind, they will bear the gods' burden that the gods may rest." The god Chingu, Tiamat's consort and general, is executed, and from his blood the god Ea creates humanity. Then the Anunnaki, grateful to Marduk for delivering them from Tiamat and from labour, spend a year building the Asagla, the great temple of Marduk in Babylon. When the temple is finished, Marduk holds a banquet. The Anunnaki are seated according to rank. Marduk is confirmed as king. The 50 great gods, the text says, decree his 50 names, each name embodying a different aspect of his power. The poem ends with a catalogue of these names, and an exhortation to remember them. The Enuma Elish does not contain a king list or a chronology, but it is set in the same temporal framework as the Sumerian king list. The creation of humanity and the establishment of divine kingship happen before the flood, in the time when the Anunnaki are active on Earth. Later Babylonian chronographic texts attempt to correlate the events of the Enuma Elish with the events of the king list, though the correlations are schematic and inconsistent. What is consistent is the claim that there was a time, before the flood, when the gods ruled directly, and that the transition from divine rule to human rule was marked by a catastrophic event that reset the world. The flood itself, as described in the Sumerian, Akkadian, and later Hebrew traditions, is not a local event, it is a cosmic event. In the Atrahasis epic, the storm god Adad is described as roaring in the clouds, while the Anunnaki, terrified, retreat to the highest heaven. The description is vivid. The stillness of the storm god passed over the sky, all that was bright turned into darkness. He smashed the land like a pot. For one day the tempest blew, quickly it blew, and the flood came forth, it passed over the people like a battle. Brother could not see brother, people could not be recognized from the sky. Even the gods were afraid of the deluge. They withdrew, they went up to the heaven of Anu, the gods cowered like dogs crouched at the outer defence. The image of the gods cowering like dogs is repeated almost verbatim in the Gilgamesh flood account. It suggests that the flood was understood not merely as a natural disaster, but as an event that threatened the cosmic order itself, an event that even the gods could not control once it was set in motion. In the Sumerian flood story, the surviving fragment is less dramatic but equally explicit. Ziusudra is warned by Enki. He builds the boat. The flood comes. The text says, "All the windstorms, exceedingly powerful, attacked as one. At the same time, the flood swept over the cult centres. After for 7 days and 7 nights the flood had swept over the land, and the huge boat had been tossed about by the windstorms on the great waters, Utu came forth, who sheds light on heaven and earth. Ziusudra opened a window of the huge boat, and the hero Utu brought his rays into the giant boat. Utu is the sun god. His appearance signals the end of the storm. Ziusudra offers sacrifice. The gods smell the offering and gather, and an Enlil grants Ziusudra eternal life and settle him in Dilmun, the place where the sun rises, a phrase that some interpreters have understood as a reference to the east, possibly the Indus Valley, possibly a mythical location beyond geography. The question of what caused the flood is not answered in the texts with anything resembling a physical mechanism. Enlil decrees it. The gods execute it. The reason given is overpopulation and noise, but that reason is presented as Enlil's subjective annoyance, not as a cosmic necessity. Enki objects to the flood and subverts it, but he does not prevent it. The flood happens. The world is reset. Kingship is lowered from heaven a second time. The Anunnaki remain, but their mode of governance changes. The direct rule of the antediluvian period gives way to the mediated rule of the dynastic period, in which human kings serve as representatives of the gods, enacting the will of the divine assembly but no longer identical with it. This theological structure underlies the entire Mesopotamian political system for the next 3,000 years. Every king of Sumer, Akkad, Babylon and Assyria will claim to rule by divine appointment. Every royal inscription will begin with a formula crediting the king's authority to the decision of the great gods, particularly An, Enlil and Enki or Ea. The king is called the shepherd, the provider, the chosen one, the beloved of the gods, but never a god himself. The one exception is the brief period during the Akkadian Empire and the other three dynasty, when some kings accepted divine honours and had their names written with the divine determinative, the cuneiform sign that marks a word as the name of a god. But even in those cases, the divine status was understood as conferred, not inherent. The king became divine by appointment, and the appointment could be revoked. When the third dynasty of Ur fell to invaders from Elam and the Amorite tribes in the 21st century before the Common Era, the scribes who wrote the lamentation over the destruction of Ur interpreted the fall as evidence that the gods had withdrawn their support. The Anunnaki did not intervene. Enlil had decreed the city's destruction, and no human king, no matter how pious, could reverse a divine decree. The memory of the antediluvian period thus functions in Mesopotamian thought as both a historical claim and a theological axiom. It is the time when the relationship between gods and humans was different. It is the time when the me were established. It is the time whose end is marked by a catastrophe so total that it serves as the reference point for all later chronology. Before the flood and after the flood are not merely chronological markers, they are ontological categories. The world before the flood is the world in which the Anunnaki rule. The world after the flood is the world in which humans rule under the supervision of the Anunnaki. The king list records the transition. 241,200 years of direct rule, then the reset, then history as the scribes knew it. In the city of Kish, on the west bank of the Euphrates, about 12 miles east of Babylon, a stone foundation deposit is being laid beneath the corner of a new temple. The year is approximately 2,600 years before the Common Era, the early dynastic period, and the king is a man whose name will be lost to time but whose city will be remembered. The priest in charge of the ceremony holds a copper tablet on which an inscription has been engraved. The inscription names the king, names the temple, names the god to whom the temple is dedicated, and includes a genealogy tracing the king's lineage back through 7 generations. The 7th name on the list is not a human name, it is the name of a god. The priest lowers the tablet into the hole, covers it with earth, and the first mud bricks are laid on top. This practice, tracing royal lineage to a divine ancestor, will continue in Mesopotamia for more than 2,000 years. The kings of Uruk will claim descent from the god Lugalbanda. The kings of Ur will claim descent from the moon god Nana. The kings of Babylon will claim appointment by Marduk. The boundary between divine and human kingship is permeable in the official ideology, and the king list is the textual foundation of that permeability. The post-flood section of the Sumerian king list begins with the first dynasty of Kish. 23 kings are listed. The first, Gea-ur, ruled 1,200 years. The second, Gula-nidaba-anapad, 960 years. The third, Palakinatim, 900 years. The reigns decrease irregularly until by the 23rd king of Kish, the length has dropped to 600 years. Then kingship passes to Uruk. The first dynasty of Uruk includes 12 kings. The first is Meshki-Angasha, who is described in the text as both a king and a high priest, and who entered the sea and disappeared. The second king of Uruk is Enmerkar, who ruled 420 years. The third is Lugalbanda, who ruled 1,200 years. The fourth is Dumuzid, a different Dumuzid from the antediluvian shepherd, who ruled 100 years. The fifth is Gilgamesh, who ruled 126 years. Gilgamesh is the only king from this section of the list who is attested in a large independent mythological corpus. The Epic of Gilgamesh, preserved in multiple versions across 2,000 years, describes him as 2/3 god and 1/3 human, a semi-divine hero of immense strength who seeks and fails to achieve immortality. The epic makes reference to the flood. Gilgamesh, seeking to escape death, travels to the end of the world to meet Utnapishtim, the Akkadian equivalent of Ziusudra, the man who survived the flood and was granted eternal life. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story of the flood, the same story told in the Atrahasis epic, and then tells him that immortality is not available to later generations. The flood was a unique event. The gift of eternal life was a unique exception. Gilgamesh returns to Uruk empty-handed, and the epic ends with his acceptance of mortality. The inclusion of Gilgamesh in the king list at a reign length of 126 years places him roughly 200 generations after the flood, if the reigns are taken literally, or roughly 6 to 8 generations after the flood if the reigns are understood as dynastic spans rather than individual lifespans. Either way, he's situated in the early post-flood period, close enough to the reset that the memory of the flood is still direct. In the epic, Utnapishtim is still alive. In the king list, the transition from flood to historical time is still in process. The reigns are still superhuman, but are trending downward. By the time the king list reaches the dynasty of Lagash in the mid-3rd millennium, the reign lengths have stabilized at realistic values. Urnanshi of Lagash ruled approximately 25 years, his son Akurgal ruled approximately 15 years. The lengths are now consistent with inscriptional and archaeological evidence. Cylinder seals bearing the names of these kings have been found in controlled excavations. Building inscriptions name them. Year names, administrative records that identify a year by a memorable event such as the construction of a temple or a military victory. Cross-reference between cities. From this point onward, the king list merges seamlessly with conventional historiography. The pre-flood section and the early post-flood section remain anomalous, but they are not separated from the rest of the text. They are the opening chapters of a single continuous record. The question that remains is, why did the scribes who compiled the king list believe that the antediluvian reigns lasted tens of thousands of years? Several explanations have been proposed, none mutually exclusive. The first is mathematical. The numbers in the antediluvian section are not arbitrary. They are multiples of 60, the base of the Sumerian numerical system, and of 3,600 the Sa. Some scholars have suggested that the antediluvian section preserves a very old tradition of counting time in Sas rather than in years, and that later scribes, no longer understanding the original unit, interpreted the Sas as years and thus inflated the chronology. This hypothesis requires that the original text said something like, Alulim ruled 8 units, with the unit left implicit, and that a later copyist assumed the unit was years rather than something else. There is some support for this in the fact that variant versions of the king list give different totals for the antediluvian period. The Sumerian version gives 241,000 years. Berossus gives 432,000 years. The discrepancy suggests that the numbers were being recalculated or reinterpreted during transmission. A second explanation is theological. The antediluvian kings were not human, or not entirely human, and therefore their lifespans were not constrained by human biology. The text does not explicitly say this, but it is consistent with the broader Mesopotamian theology in which the boundary between gods and humans is fluid, and the antediluvian period is the time when that boundary was most permeable. If Alulim was an Anunnaki, or if he was a human granted extended life by the Anunnaki, then a reign of 28,000 years is not a chronological claim, but a statement about his ontological status. The same logic applies to the early post-flood kings. Gilgamesh is described as 2/3 god. His lifespan exceeds the normal human range, but not by the order of magnitude of the antediluvian kings. The progression from 28,000 years to 126 years to 25 years is smooth and continuous, which suggests that the scribes understood the reign lengths as encoding information about the degree of divine involvement in kingship. A third explanation is literary. The Sumerian king list is not a chronicle. It is a structured narrative with a clear arc: descent, crisis, reset, recovery. The antediluvian section establishes the cosmic scale of history. The flood provides the dramatic center. The post-flood section traces the gradual normalization of the world until the present moment, which is the time of the scribe compiling the list. The enormous numbers serve a narrative function. They distinguish the mythic past from the historical present without separating them. The king list does not present two kinds of time, mythic and historical. It presents one kind of time that changes in scale and quality as it moves from origin to present. The antediluvian section is not myth disguised as history. It is the beginning of history, narrated on a cosmic scale. A fourth explanation, less discussed in conventional scholarship but present in the ancient commentaries, is that the antediluvian section records real events that are no longer understood because the method of observation or record keeping has been lost. This explanation appears in fragmentary form in Berossus and is elaborated by some of the later Greek and Christian authors who quote him. Berossus claims to have based his history on records preserved in the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, records that he says go back to the time before the flood. He describes the antediluvian kings as recipients of divine knowledge, taught directly by beings who came from the sea. The most famous of these is Oannes, described as a creature with the body of a fish and the head of a man, who emerged from the Persian Gulf in the time of the first king and taught humanity writing, mathematics, agriculture, law, and temple building. Oannes and similar figures, called the Apkallu in later Akkadian tradition, are described as sages sent by Ea to civilize humanity. 7 Apkallu are named in the tradition, one for each of the antediluvian kings except the first. The Apkallu tradition does not appear in the early Sumerian sources, but it is consistent with the broader pattern in which civilization is understood as a gift from the gods, not a human invention. The Apkallu are depicted in Neo-Assyrian palace reliefs from the first millennium before the Common Era as winged, human-headed figures carrying ritual objects. Inscriptions identify them as protective spirits, guardians of sacred knowledge. In some texts, they are associated with Eridu and with the time before the flood. In the Babylonian Omen series, they are invoked as authorities on divination and magic. The tradition holds that the Apkallu were destroyed or removed at the time of the flood, and that the knowledge they brought had to be reconstructed from fragmentary records and oral tradition. This reconstruction is what the scribes of the post-flood period understood themselves to be doing, recovering the wisdom of the antediluvian age, preserved in the temple libraries, encoded in the god lists, the king lists, the ritual instructions, and the hymns. In the city of Sippar, in the temple of Shamash, in the 7th century before the Common Era, the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal sends his scribes to copy the old tablets stored in the temple archive. Ashurbanipal is building a library at his capital, Nineveh, and he wants copies of every significant text in Mesopotamia. The scribes arrive at Sippar with blank tablets and styluses and spend months copying. Among the texts they copy is a damaged version of the Sumerian king list, and a series of omen commentaries that reference the antediluvian kings. One of the omen texts associates Enmen-Durana, the 7th king, with the invention of divination and hepatoscopy, the reading of omens from the livers of sacrificed animals. The text says that Enmen-Durana was taken up to heaven by the sun god Shamash and shown the secrets of the gods, and that he then returned to earth and taught these secrets to the priests of Sippar. This is the same figure mentioned earlier, the only antediluvian king to have a narrative tradition separate from the king list. The omen text treats Enmen-Durana as a historical figure, the founder of a line of knowledge transmission that continues unbroken to the time of Ashurbanipal. The library at Nineveh was destroyed when the city was sacked in 612 before the Common Era. The palace burned. The tablets in the library were fired in the heat, which preserved them, and they were buried under the rubble. 22 centuries later, in the mid-19th century of the Common Era, archaeologists excavating the mound of Kuyunjik, the site of ancient Nineveh, discovered more than 30,000 tablets and fragments. Among them were copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Enuma Elish, the Atrahasis Epic, astronomical texts, medical texts, omen series, rituals, hymns, and multiple versions of the Sumerian king list. The texts were shipped to the British Museum, deciphered over the following decades, and published. The Sumerian king list was first published in full by Thorkild Jakobsen in 1939, based on a collation of all known manuscripts. Jakobsen's edition remains the standard reference. What the discovery of the Nineveh library demonstrated is that the textual tradition of Mesopotamia was cumulative and conservative. Texts were copied for millennia with minimal variation. The Sumerian king list found at Nineveh is essentially identical to versions found at Nippur, Ur, Larsa and Isin, despite being separated by centuries and by the shift from Sumerian to Akkadian as the dominant language. The antediluvian section is present in all versions. The numbers vary slightly between manuscripts, but the structure is constant. This consistency suggests that the scribes who transmitted the king list understood it as a fixed tradition, not a flexible narrative. It was a reference text, a framework within which other historical and theological claims could be situated. It is the 8th month of the year, the month sacred to the god Dumuzi, and the temple of Inanna at Uruk is preparing for the sacred marriage rite. The ritual has been performed annually for as long as anyone can remember. The high priestess, who embodies the goddess Inanna, and the king, who embodies the god Dumuzi, will enact a symbolic union that ensures the fertility of the land for the coming year. The theological justification for the rite is recorded in a series of hymns known as the Dumuzi-Inanna cycle, some of which date back to the early dynastic period. The hymns describe Inanna choosing Dumuzi as her husband, their courtship, their marriage, his death, and her descent to the underworld to retrieve him. But embedded in the hymns is a chronological claim that connects the ritual to the antediluvian period. One of the hymns states that Dumuzi was a king before the flood, that he ruled in Bad Tabira, and that the sacred marriage rite was instituted during his reign as a means of binding the divine and human realms together. The ritual performed at Uruk in the historical period is thus understood as a continuation of a practice that began in the time of the Anunnaki before the flood reset the world. This pattern, rituals in the present understood as reenactments of events in the antediluvian past, appears throughout Mesopotamian religious practice. The New Year festival, the Akitu, celebrated in Babylon during the first millennium before the Common Era, includes a recitation of the Enuma Elish, the creation epic. The recitation is not a storytelling performance, it is an act of ritual repetition that reactualizes the creation, renews the cosmic order, and reaffirms the kingship of Marduk. The theology behind the ritual holds that the cosmos is not a stable given, but a maintained order, an order that was established in the beginning and that must be continuously renewed through correct ritual action. The beginning in this framework is the antediluvian period, the time when the Mi were first established, when the Anunnaki ruled, when the patterns that govern reality were laid down. The Mi themselves are central to this theology. The word has no direct equivalent in English. It is sometimes translated as divine power, sometimes as cultural norm, sometimes as cosmic principle. The Mi are treated in the texts as both abstractions and concrete objects. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, Inanna gets Enki drunk and steals the Mi, loading them onto the boat of heaven and sailing from Eridu to Uruk. Enki, when he sobers up, sends his servants to retrieve the Mi, but Inanna reaches Uruk and unloads them before the servants catch up. The Mi she has stolen include kingship, priesthood, truth, descent into the underworld, ascent from the underworld, the art of lovemaking, the destruction of cities, lamentation, and more than 90 others. The poem treats the Mi as transferable objects that can be physically moved from one city to another, but it also treats them as the fundamental structures of civilization. Without the Mi, there is no order. Without the Mi, there is no kingship, no temple, no law, no music, no family, no identity. The Mi are what distinguish cosmos from chaos. The claim that the Mi were established in the antediluvian period and that they survived the flood implies that the flood did not destroy the cosmic order. It destroyed the physical world, the cities, the people, the animals, but it did not destroy the Mi. The Mi were preserved, either because they are eternal and cannot be destroyed, or because Enki and the other gods protected them. After the flood, when kingship was lowered from heaven a second time, the Mi were reinstated. The cities were rebuilt according to the same patterns. The temples were dedicated to the same gods. The rituals were performed in the same manner. The king list itself is a Mi. It is the record of how kingship has been transmitted from the beginning to the present, and the act of copying the king list is an act of preserving and transmitting the Mi of kingship. The scribes who copied the king list understood their work in these terms. They were not historians in the modern sense. They were ritual specialists, preserving a tradition that they believed to be both true and sacred. The truth value of the tradition was not empirical. It was not verified by digging up physical objects or by cross-referencing independent sources. It was verified by the continuity of transmission. The king list was true because it had been copied correctly, because it was stored in the temple archive, because it was taught in the scribal schools, and because it was referenced in other authoritative texts. The antediluvian section was true for the same reasons. No one in the historical period had seen Alulim or walked in antediluvian Eridu, but the record of Alulim was preserved in the House of Tablets, and the city of Eridu still stood, and the temple of Enki was still active, and the priests of Enki still claimed an unbroken line of transmission from the foundation of the temple to the present day. This mode of verification by transmission rather than by observation, is characteristic of oral and scribal cultures in which literacy is restricted and texts are scarce. The authority of a text derives from its age, its source, and the care with which it has been preserved. A text copied from an older text is more authoritative than a newly composed text. A text stored in a temple archive is more authoritative than a text stored in a private house. A text taught in the scribal school is more authoritative than a text known only to a single scribe. The Sumerian king list meets all these criteria. It was old, it was copied from temple archives, it was taught in the scribal curriculum, and it was consistent across multiple manuscript traditions. By the standards of the culture that produced it, it was as authoritative as any text could be. The Greek and Roman historians who encountered Mesopotamian chronology in the Hellenistic period were baffled by the antediluvian numbers. Berossus, writing in Greek for a Greek audience in the early 3rd century before the Common Era, reported the Babylonian tradition faithfully, but offered no explanation for the enormous reign lengths. Later, Greek chronographers attempted to rationalize the numbers by proposing that the years were not solar years but months, or that the reigns were dynastic totals rather than individual lifespans. The Jewish historian Josephus, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, compared the Babylonian antediluvian kings to the biblical patriarchs listed in Genesis, noting that both traditions featured extremely long lifespans before a great flood. The biblical patriarchs, Adam, Seth, Enosh, Kenan, Mahalalel, Jared, Enoch, Methuselah, Lamech, Noah, are each said to have lived between 300 and 969 years. The total span from Adam to the flood is 1,656 years, according to the Masoretic text, 2,262 years according to the Septuagint. These numbers are much smaller than the Sumerian numbers, but the pattern is the same: long lifespans before the flood, shorter lifespans after. Some early Christian chronographers, notably Eusebius of Caesarea and Jerome, attempted to synchronize the Mesopotamian and biblical chronologies. Eusebius, in his chronicle compiled in the early 4th century, lists the antediluvian kings from Berossus alongside the antediluvian patriarchs from Genesis and tries to align the flood dates. The exercise is inconclusive because the sources give incompatible totals, but the fact that Eusebius attempted it demonstrates that he took both traditions seriously as chronological records. The later Byzantine chronographers abandoned the attempt and relegated the antediluvian sections of both traditions to the category of mythical time, a separate chronological regime not subject to normal historical methods. Modern scholarship has followed the Byzantine lead. The standard treatment of the Sumerian king list in academic literature acknowledges the antediluvian section, notes the impossibility of the numbers, and moves on to the post-flood dynasties that can be correlated with external evidence. The antediluvian section is classified as myth or legend, a narrative preamble that establishes the ideological framework for the historical portion of the text. This classification is methodologically defensible. There is no physical evidence that supports the claim that kings ruled for tens of thousands of years. There is no independent textual tradition that confirms the existence of Alulim or Enmenluana. The cities named in the antediluvian section show no archaeological evidence of occupation before the 6th millennium before the Common Era. The chronology is irreconcilable with everything known from geology, paleontology, and archaeology about the development of human civilization. But the methodological defensibility of the classification does not explain why the ancient scribes included the antediluvian section, why they transmitted it with such care, and why they never marked it as doubtful or metaphorical. The scribes who copied the king list were not naive. They were trained specialists with decades of education in grammar, lexicography, mathematics, and textual criticism. They knew the difference between a historical king like Ur-Nammu, whose monuments could still be seen, and an antediluvian king like Alulim, whose reign was known only from the text. Yet they placed both in the same list, in the same format, with the same level of detail. The implication is that they believed the antediluvian section recorded something real, even if the nature of that reality was not the same as the nature of the historical dynasties. One possibility, suggested by some recent scholars, is that the antediluvian section records a cultural memory of a much earlier phase of human civilization, a phase that left no material trace, but that was remembered in oral tradition and eventually written down. This hypothesis requires that the oral tradition be accurate over a span of tens of thousands of years, which is generally considered implausible. Human oral traditions are known to preserve information for hundreds of years, sometimes for a few thousand years if the tradition is maintained by a professional class of specialists, but accuracy over tens of thousands of years would require a level of cultural continuity for which there is no ethnographic parallel. On the other hand, the hypothesis has the virtue of taking the text seriously on its own terms. The king list claims to record the reigns of kings who ruled before the flood. If the flood is understood as a real event, a catastrophic climate event at the end of the last ice age, then the antediluvian section could be understood as a memory, however distorted, of human societies that existed during the ice age and were destroyed by the rising sea levels and climate shifts that accompanied the glacial melt. The end of the last ice age, approximately 11,700 years ago, was marked by rapid and dramatic climate change. Sea levels rose by more than 100 meters over the course of several thousand years. Coastlines that had been habitable were inundated. River valleys flooded. The Persian Gulf, which had been dry land during the glacial maximum, filled with water. The Black Sea, according to one widely discussed hypothesis, was flooded suddenly when the Mediterranean breached the Bosporus, an event that would have been catastrophic for any human populations living in the lowlands around the Black Sea basin. These events are well documented in the geological record, and they occurred within the time frame of modern human history. If the flood traditions of Mesopotamia, the Levant and the Eastern Mediterranean preserve a cultural memory of the End Ice Age inundations, then the antediluvian kings could represent a garbled memory of the societies that existed before those inundations, societies that were literate or proto-literate, and that kept records that were later incorporated into the mythological traditions of the successor cultures. This hypothesis is speculative and not widely accepted, but it has the advantage of offering a naturalistic explanation for the antediluvian section without dismissing it as pure invention. The alternative is to accept that the antediluvian section is a theological construct with no historical referent, a narrative device meant to establish the divine origin of kingship and the cosmic scale of history. Both explanations may be partially true. The king list may preserve a dim cultural memory of pre-flood societies, and that memory may have been shaped and elaborated over millennia into a theological narrative that serves the ideological needs of the scribal elite. A caravan is crossing the Syrian desert in the late 3rd millennium before the Common Era. The camels are loaded with cedar logs from the mountains of Lebanon, destined for the temple-building projects in the cities of Sumer. Among the travellers is a merchant from Uruk, who has spent the past 6 months in the coastal cities of the Levant, trading grain and textiles for timber and copper. He carries with him a clay tablet wrapped in linen, a copy of the Sumerian king list that he commissioned from a scribe in Byblos. The scribe was Sumerian trained, educated in the scribal school at Ur before moving west to serve the merchant community in the Levantine ports. The merchant plans to donate the tablet to the temple of Inanna when he returns to Uruk. He has read the text during the quiet hours of the journey, and one section has stayed with him. The description of the antediluvian kings and their impossibly long reigns. He has asked the other merchants in the caravan whether they have heard similar traditions. One, a man from the city of Ebla in northern Syria, says that his people have their own king lists, and that the earliest kings in those lists are also described as ruling for lifespans far beyond the normal human range. Another, a trader from the Indus Valley, says that the sacred texts of his homeland speak of ages of the world, cycles of creation and destruction, and that the current age is only the most recent in a series that stretches back millions of years. The merchant from Uruk listens and considers. The world, it seems, remembers a time before the present order, a time when the rules were different. The idea that the present world is not the first world, that there have been previous cycles of creation, destruction and renewal, appears in multiple ancient traditions. In the Mesopotamian texts, this cycle is linear. Creation, antediluvian period, flood, post-flood period, present. There is no indication that the cycle will repeat. The flood is a unique event. But in other traditions, particularly those of South Asia, the cycle is repetitive. The Hindu Puranas describe a cosmology of yugas, vast ages of declining virtue and increasing chaos, culminating in a cosmic dissolution and renewal. The current age, the Kali Yuga, is the 4th and final age in the cycle, and it is characterized by strife, moral decay, and the loss of ancient knowledge. The Kali Yuga is said to have begun in 3102 before the Common Era, approximately 5,000 years ago, and it will last for 432,000 years, after which the cycle will begin again. The number 432,000 is notable because it is the same total given by Berosus for the antediluvian period in the Babylonian tradition. The coincidence has led some scholars to propose contact or common origin between the Mesopotamian and South Asian chronological traditions, though the evidence for such contact in the 3rd millennium is minimal. A similar cyclical cosmology appears in the Mesoamerican traditions of the Maya and Aztec. The Aztec creation myth describes 5 successive worlds, each created and destroyed by the gods. The first world was destroyed by jaguars, the second by hurricanes, the third by rain of fire, the fourth by flood. The 5th world, the current world, is sustained by human sacrifice and will eventually be destroyed by earthquakes. The Maya long count calendar, developed in the 1st millennium before the Common Era, measures time from a creation date in 3114 before the Common Era, roughly contemporary with the beginning of the Kali Yuga in the Hindu tradition, and roughly contemporary with the beginning of the dynastic period in Mesopotamia. The parallels are striking but difficult to explain. The distances are vast. The cultures had no known contact. Yet all 3 traditions, Mesopotamian, South Asian and Mesoamerican, preserve the concept of a primordial age that ended in catastrophe and was followed by a new order characterized by shorter lifespans, harder labor, and the loss of direct contact with the divine. The hypothesis of a common source for these traditions, sometimes called the Atlantis hypothesis or the lost civilization hypothesis, has a long history in popular and alternative scholarship but little support in mainstream academia. The hypothesis holds that the shared motifs, antediluvian kings, long lifespans, catastrophic floods, lost knowledge, reflect the memory of a single advanced civilization that existed during the Ice Age and was destroyed by the climate changes at the end of the glacial period. Proponents of this hypothesis point to the synchronicity of the flood myths, the presence of megalithic architecture in widely separated regions, and the sophistication of early metallurgy, mathematics, and astronomy as evidence that the Neolithic and Bronze Age civilizations inherited knowledge from an earlier, now lost source. The mainstream response is that the similarities are the result of convergent cultural evolution, that flood myths are common because floods are common, that long-lived ancestors are a narrative device to bridge the gap between mythical and historical time, and that there is no archaeological evidence for a global Ice Age civilization. The debate cannot be resolved from the texts alone. The Sumerian king list does not claim that the antediluvian kings ruled over a global empire. It claims that they ruled 5 cities in southern Mesopotamia. The Anunnaki are not described as colonizers from elsewhere. They are described as the children of An, the gods of the land, the ones who established the cosmic order in the place where the texts were written. The theology is local, not universal, but the theology also claims that the antediluvian period lasted 241,000 years, which is longer than the entire span of recorded history by 2 orders of magnitude. If the number is symbolic, the text does not say so. If the number is an error, the error was never corrected across more than 1,000 years of transmission. The simplest explanation consistent with the evidence is that the scribes who transmitted the king list believed the number to be accurate, and that they had no reason to doubt it because it was part of a received tradition that they considered authoritative. What that tradition was based on, whether it was pure myth, garbled history, theological speculation, or some combination, cannot be determined from the surviving sources. The antediluvian period lies beyond the reach of archaeology. If cities existed in southern Mesopotamia 241,000 years ago, they are buried under hundreds of meters of alluvial sediment deposited by the Tigris and Euphrates over the intervening millennia, or they were submerged when the Persian Gulf filled with water at the end of the Ice Age. The sea level in the Persian Gulf at the last glacial maximum 20,000 years ago was approximately 120 meters lower than today. The coastline was hundreds of kilometers to the south and east of the present coast. The Tigris and Euphrates joined into a single river that flowed through what is now the floor of the Gulf. If human settlements existed along that river, they are now underwater. Deep-sea surveys of the Gulf floor have identified several submerged features that may be riverbeds or channels, but no archaeological investigation has been conducted at the necessary depth. The same is true for other regions that were above water during the Ice Age and are now submerged. The Sunda Shelf in Southeast Asia, the continental shelf around the British Isles, the coastal margins of the Indian subcontinent, the Black Sea Basin, all were dry land during the glacial maximum and were inundated as the ice sheets melted. If the hypothesis is correct that coastal regions were preferentially settled by early human populations because of access to marine resources, then a significant portion of the Paleolithic and early Neolithic archaeological record is now underwater and inaccessible. This does not prove that advanced civilizations existed during the Ice Age. It means that the question cannot be answered conclusively with the data currently available. What can be said with confidence is that the Sumerian king list, as transmitted in the temple archives and scribal schools of Mesopotamia, presents a chronology that begins 241,000 years before the flood and continues in an unbroken sequence through the flood to the historical dynasties of the 3rd and 2nd millennia before the Common Era. The text does not distinguish between mythical and historical time. It does not mark the antediluvian section as doubtful. It integrates the pre-flood and post-flood periods into a single framework, with kingship as the unifying principle. Kingship was lowered from heaven. It was held by the Anunnaki or by kings appointed by the Anunnaki. The flood came. Kingship was lowered again. The reigns shortened. The cities were rebuilt. The temples were rededicated. The rituals were resumed. The Mi were transmitted. And the record of all this was preserved in the House of Tablets, copied generation after generation, taught to the apprentice scribes, referenced in omen texts and ritual instructions, and ultimately buried in the ruins of Nineveh, Nippur, Ur, and Babylon, where it waited for 2,500 years until the archaeologists of the 19th century dug it up and read it again. The king list is not an isolated text. It is embedded in a vast textual tradition that includes myths, hymns, laments, laws, omens, and administrative records. The antediluvian section of the king list is consistent with the broader mythology of the Anunnaki, the theology of the Mi, the structure of the flood narrative, and the concept of cyclical renewal through ritual. It is part of a coherent worldview, a way of understanding the relationship between gods and humans, between past and present, between order and chaos. That worldview may be based on historical memory, or it may be a theological construct, or it may be both. The text itself does not answer the question. It simply records what the tradition said, that before the flood, 8 kings ruled 5 cities for 241,200 years, and that after the flood, kingship continued and the world began again. In the ruins of the city of Shuruppak, modern Tel Farah, archaeologists in the early 20th century excavated a layer of sediment approximately 1 meter thick, composed of water-laid silt and clay, dated to approximately 2,900 years before the Common Era. Above the sediment layer were the remains of early Dynastic III architecture. Below it were earlier occupation levels. The excavators initially interpreted the sediment layer as evidence of the biblical flood, and the discovery was widely reported in the press. Later analysis showed that the sediment was the result of a local river flood, not a regional or global inundation, and that similar flood deposits of various dates have been found at other sites in southern Mesopotamia. No single flood horizon is present at all sites, which means that no single catastrophic flood affected the entire region at the same time. The flood of the Sumerian tradition is either a memory of one particularly severe local flood, or a composite memory of multiple floods over time, or a mythological event with no direct historical referent. The question remains open. What is not open to question is that the Sumerians believed in the flood, that they dated their history relative to it, and that they preserved detailed records of what they believed had come before. Those records are the subject of this script, the Sumerian king list. 241,000 years of Anunnaki rule, 8 kings, 5 cities, 1 flood, and then the beginning of history as we know it. It is evening in Nippur, and the junior scribe who began copying the Sumerian king list many weeks ago has finished his work. He has made 3 complete copies of the text, one for the temple archive, one for the scribal school, and one for the palace. The tablets are drying on the shelf near the window. Tomorrow they will be fired in the kiln, hardened to permanence. He sits now in the courtyard, watching the stars appear as the light fades. His teacher approaches and sits beside him. "You have done good work," the teacher says. "The text is clear, the signs are well formed, the numbers are correct." The young scribe nods his thanks, then asks, "Master, do you believe the numbers? Do you believe that Alulim ruled for 28,000 years? The teacher is silent for a long moment. Then he says, "I believe that the text is true. Whether the truth it contains is the truth of events or the truth of meaning, I do not know. What I know is that the text has been handed down to us, and it is our task to hand it down to those who come after. If we do not preserve it, it will be lost. And if it is lost, we will lose the memory of where we came from. The young scribe considers this. And where did we come from? He asks. The teacher looks up at the sky, at the constellation of the Bull and the constellation of the Scorpion, at the planet Venus low on the western horizon. We came from the gods, he says, and before the gods ruled through us, they ruled directly. That is what the text says. That is what we remember. The transmission of the Sumerian king list continued for more than 2,000 years after that conversation, if it ever happened. The text was copied in Sumerian until Sumerian ceased to be a spoken language, sometime around 1800 years before the Common Era. After that, it was copied in Akkadian translations, and the tradition was incorporated into the Babylonian and Assyrian chronicles. When the Assyrian Empire fell and Babylon became the dominant power, the king list was updated to include the Babylonian dynasties. When Babylon fell to the Persians in 539 before the Common Era, the tradition continued under Persian rule. Berossus, writing in the early Hellenistic period, had access to versions of the king list stored in the Temple of Marduk in Babylon, and he used them as the basis for his history. When the temple libraries were finally closed in the early centuries of the Common Era, the tradition ended. The last datable cuneiform tablet is from the 1st century of the Common Era. After that, the script was forgotten, the language was forgotten, and the king list disappeared from human knowledge for more than 1,800 years. The rediscovery began in the 1840s, when European archaeologists and adventurers started excavating the mounds of Mesopotamia. The decipherment of cuneiform was completed by the 1850s. The first fragments of the king list were published in the 1860s. By the early 20th century, enough manuscripts had been found and collated to reconstruct the full text. The antediluvian section, when it was finally understood, was met with skepticism by most scholars and with fascination by a minority. The numbers were too large. The names were unattested in other sources. The theology was too strange. Mainstream scholarship classified the antediluvian section as myth and focused on the post-flood dynasties that could be correlated with external evidence, but the text itself remained clear and unambiguous. Before the flood, kingship existed. It was held by 8 kings in 5 cities for 241,200 years. Then the flood came. Then kingship was restored. The list continued. The question of what the Sumerians meant by the antediluvian section is a question that may never be fully answered. The scribes who compiled the king list left no commentary explaining their intentions. The myths and hymns that refer to the Anunnaki and the antediluvian period are narratives, not treatises. They describe actions and events. They do not analyze or theorize. The closest thing to an explicit statement of purpose is the opening formula. When kingship was lowered from heaven, kingship is not a human invention. It is a divine gift. It has a history. That history begins before the flood, in a time when the gods ruled the earth directly. The 8 kings named in the antediluvian section are either gods or the first humans appointed to rule in the gods' stead. The Anunnaki, the children of An, the great gods who decreed fates and judged the dead, were the rulers of that age. Their rule lasted for a span of time so vast that it cannot be comprehended in human terms. Then the flood came. The rule of the Anunnaki ended or changed form. Kingship was given to humans. The reign shortened. The world became the world we recognize. What can be said with certainty is that the Sumerian king list is not a work of fiction in the modern sense. It is a historical record as understood by the culture that produced it. It is based on sources that the scribes considered authoritative: temple archives, oral traditions, god lists, ritual texts. It was transmitted with care, copied accurately, taught in the schools, and referenced in other authoritative documents. It was not questioned or revised in any fundamental way across more than 1,000 years of use, and it begins, unambiguously and without apology, with a claim that kingship existed on earth for 241,000 years before the flood, and that the rulers of that age were the Anunnaki. Whether the claim is literally true, symbolically true, or a theological construct designed to legitimize the institution of kingship is a question that each reader of the text must answer, according to their own framework of interpretation. The text itself does not provide the answer. It provides the claim: 8 kings, 5 cities, 241,200 years. The Anunnaki ruled, the flood came, kingship continued, and the memory of what came before was written into clay, fired hard, and buried in the ruins of temples and palaces, waiting to be found. You have been listening to a documentary about the Sumerian king list, the antediluvian period, and the 241,000 years of Anunnaki rule that the text records. The sources for this account are the cuneiform tablets themselves, the manuscripts of the king list from Nippur, Ur, Lhasa, Izin, and Nineveh, the myths and hymns of the Sumerian literary corpus, the Akkadian epics of Atrahasis, Gilgamesh, and the Enuma Elish, the temple hymns attributed to Enheduanna, the law codes of Ur-Nammu and Hammurabi, the omen series and ritual instructions, and the fragments of Berossus preserved in the works of later Greek and Christian authors. The account you have heard is built from those texts in their own words, without addition or speculation beyond what the sources themselves provide. What the Sumerians believed about their past is now part of the record. What that belief represents, whether history, myth, theology, or memory, is a question that remains open. If you found this topic worthwhile, there are other long-form scripts on this channel that explore adjacent questions. The development of writing in the 4th millennium, the theology of the Me, the archaeology of Eridu and Uruk, the flood traditions of the ancient Near East. Each script is built in the same manner as this one, from the primary sources in calm and steady exposition, designed to be heard slowly over the course of hours. The format is intentional. The topics deserve time. The sleep documentary approach allows that time without demanding alertness. If you stay to the end, you now know what the Sumerian king list says about the time before the flood. That knowledge is not common. Most histories skip the antediluvian section, or mention it only in passing. You have heard it in full. The 8 kings, the 5 cities, the 241,000 years, the Anunnaki, and the flood that reset the world. The stars above Nippur are the same stars the scribe saw when he finished his copy of the king list. The constellations have shifted slightly over the millennia due to precession, but the patterns remain recognizable. The bull, the scorpion, the goatfish, the lion. The Sumerians called them the same names we do. They mapped the sky. They measured time. They recorded what they knew and what they believed, and they left it for us to find, buried in the dust of cities that fell silent long before Greece or Rome was born.